Welcome to Shareholders of a Better World, brought to you by TBLI Group. At TBLI Group, we have an established reputation as an organization dedicated to building the ecosystem of global sustainability and impact investing. We're doing this through educating, advising, and facilitating transactions in global sustainability and impact business, as well as capital solutions for private companies, family offices, and fund groups. For nearly 25 years, TBLI Group has created a vertically integrated ecosystem of education to action through TBLI conferences and TBLI consulting. More about our company can be found at tbligroup.com. This webinar is brought to you by TBLI Foundation, which hosts educational learning experiences dedicated to a better planet. Through the foundation, we build sustainable communities by sharing the people and the experiences making a difference to so many of our lives around the world. Our weekly podcasts bring impact thought leaders that are doing and not only chatting. Now let me introduce my guest today. Good afternoon from our studios in Amsterdam, shareholders of a better world. Our guests today are Will Ruddick and Carolyn Dama, who are going to be talking about digital currencies that were established starting in Kenya to address the pandemic and other problems. And is it actually a solution for community development? Ladies first, Carolyn, please tell the audience who you are, what you're doing, and what is the intention of that. One technical issue, I want to welcome everyone who's joined: Hugo, Glenn, Arthur, Evelyn, Brian, Sonia, Tamar, James, Cecile, Batia, and Bieta. If you have a question, don't type it in the chat part, type it in the open question, and we will address that as we go forward. Carolyn, the floor is yours.
I'm sorry, just trying to go. Thank you for the opportunity.
Please unmute your phone.
Dama. I come from Kenya, and we are working with my colleague in some communities in Kenya around community inclusion currencies. I am from those communities, and as part of a member of the community, it was really sad for me to see that most of the time life stops for them just because they don't have money. And it was really good to be able to come up with a solution that makes sure that life goes on. So the question is, why should we limit the communities to money? And is there a way that they can continue to meet their own basic needs, whether they have that piece of paper or not? And how can we really empower people from bottom up rather than coming up with solutions that are centralized? So for me, the idea was to look for a decentralized way to support the communities in a way that shows them that they are empowered and that the power doesn't come from outside, but rather it's just within them. Thank you.
Will, briefly explain who you are, what have you been working on for the last 3,000 years, and what is your grand vision with the digital currency on a community level?
Thanks for the opportunity. So I'm Will Ruddick. I've been working on community currencies now for, it seems like about 20 years. Just getting into the topic when I was a physicist, and then going into economics and getting into economic modeling around currencies. And there was this theory back then that I read about that, communities could potentially create their own systems and their own currency systems. And I was really intrigued by the idea. And I wanted to get into, what would those rules be? How would you create safe currency systems? And so I started studying these types of programs all around the world, and ended up in Kenya with the Peace Corps as a teacher here, and started experimenting with some local nonprofits here in Kenya to to try a local credit system. And basically, in a nutshell, the vision was, can we come up with ways to allow people without money to create credit systems and trade with each other? And in theory, there is a lot of excess capacity in communities. There's goods and services that are both on demand and in supply. They're just not meeting together. And so like what Dama was saying there is that communities can function quite well, and historically did function quite well without sort of a foreign medium of exchange being sort of injected into them, through different types of barter loops and trading different types of commodities. And so could that happen again? What would that look like? And so back in 2009, I started experimenting with what was called EcoPesa back then, which was basically the idea of going into a community and saying, would you guys like to be able to create your own barter system using your own credits? And we got together with businesses there and we printed vouchers. We came up with rules on how they could do that. And it was this kind of, a very beautiful community process. And there was a lot of backstopping with local NGOs around that. And that basic system has now evolved to about 20,000 users across Kenya. We've traded about $500,000 worth of essentially barter trade using now digital vouchers. We moved away from paper about a year and a half ago. And so the system's really started to accelerate. And in theory, these types of systems are cyclic currency. So when there is a disaster or there is a downgrade in the market or the value of the national currency, that these things pick up more. And so we've seen that kind of textbook case with COVID recently, and also working with Red Cross now. So our goal is really to enable the technology behind this to be open source and available across the world, to enable Red Cross and other communities around the world to basically create their own credit systems and do that in a really safe way.
So what is a safe way? I mean, are you just pumping out digital printing presses and you have a bunch of people delivering these digital currencies to how are you preventing it from overheating the economy, that it's back? I mean, how is it different from a fiat currency?
Sure. So, with the paper ones we started with ages ago, the idea was that they were backed one-to-one with commitments to the local community. So we would go around to all the businesses, we'd have big meetings, and we say, okay, we're going to print X amount of vouchers, we're going to distribute them like this among everyone, and you guys are going to back them with your goods and services. And these would be very small amounts, imagine like $4 worth or 400 shillings. And one of these bills, this is a Bangladesh that was 20 shillings, which is about 20 cents. And funny story about this was we had grad students coming in measuring how much it was circulating among those businesses, and the estimate was one piece of paper was trading about 700 times a year. And that was about 700 meals being added to the community because of one kind of silly piece of paper, essentially. And so that was so in the old days that it was basically us with the commitment of the community, and a lot of trust in that case. And there's a long history of community currencies being created by essentially small trusted groups. It's hard to, of course, scale that type of situation, right? And you go through more and more kind of risky situations, the more you're sort of relying on trust. And so it was around 2015 we started to try to digitalize these systems. And we started getting into things like Bitcoin, for instance, and but just couldn't really find a really good use case for it back then. But then about a year and a half ago, we stumbled upon a system called a bonding curve, which was originally developed by a group called Bancor. And basically what that did was it allowed you to create a contract on a blockchain that allowed you to insert some assets into that as a collateral and make a rule for if you want to mint or create more of these, you had to maintain a certain amount of collateral there. And so that essentially kind of simple concept of saying we want to have second by second knowledge of what is the collateral behind these. Blockchain enables us to do that in a really nice way that's transparent, and no one can mess with those contracts, but everyone can see what they are. Versus a typical bank creating credit, you don't really know what is the backing behind it. When Goldman Sachs creates, X amount of money, it's very hard to track that. So the traceability of the blockchain really helped us to sort of come up with strong rules on how much credit to be issuing, and what is the collateral behind those. So on the blockchain now, if I have one of these vouchers, and again, they're digital now, so they're on feature phones, so little button phones that are connected through the telecom to the internet. But basically, people can trade their tokens, so they have a supply of tokens that they create as a community. They can now back those tokens up with an amount of essentially national currency. That's been fixed into the blockchain as a stable token, and they can pull that back out as well. And so that's the fundamental concept, is that you have a circulating medium of exchange, just like all the, you could imagine barter credits in the past, but you also have a buffer system so that if people need to exit that network, they can do so. And what that does is it actually, it changes the exchange price now. So the less reserve there is, the less collateral there is in that network now, the less valuable essentially the local currency is to cash out, right? People are still holding it one-to-one with each other within the community, but as they start removing that collateral, it costs to cash it out more, like the value starts to drop, and vice versa, it becomes cheaper into those systems. And so this is essentially the same thing we're doing with Red Cross right now as well.
Carolyn, I'm curious, how did the community respond to this story, this American guy who's going to be a counterfeiter, digital counterfeiter, pushing out currency to people? How did people respond to that?
I think the beauty of how William approached it was in looking for institutions that were already existing in the community. And like he pointed out, it's all based on trust. And most of the time, they say that a prophet is rarely accepted in the community. And that I think also what worked for him was that here was someone that was not from the community, and ideally they don't feel like he tried to extract anything out of them. And when we approached it in terms of what's already existing in the community, what institutions are there that you can work with, who are the community gatekeepers, and what's important is creating the buy-in for the community. And William started with projects that really helped in ensuring community buy-in. For instance, I think if he had the time, he would talk about a street children's program that he did, where he taught them fire dancing, and he spent so much time, and he was able to really understand what were the issues that were affecting the community. And in doing so, I think they felt that this is someone that really has an interest in our well-being. And then the idea was also questions like, most of these communities are already receiving a lot of donor aid. And so it just comes in and then it just goes out. And most of the time when it goes out to people that don't really exist in the community. So for him to ask questions like, wouldn't it be good to have something that stays in the community, that builds the community? And of course, when we were starting, it took a lot of time, a lot of explaining, but it started as a mutual credit, and it's backed by goods and services within the community. So it's not something that's out there. It's something that they know they can do one-on-one. And also it lied in the fact that he started with really small groups, because I remember our initial group that we did in Bangladesh, in Mombasa, we started with a small saving groups. We started with around 25 people, and eventually it grew to almost over 300 people. And of course, for the other groups, it was about peer-to-peer training. Once one group really buys it in and they can say that this is something that has helped us, it was quite easy. And yes, I think the whole idea about it being counterfeit didn't even come from the communities. Because when you ask yourself, most projects that are taken and they're gone into the community don't ask really fundamental questions like, are you eating 3 square meals a day? You just want to do this huge project, but you're not asking those questions. And community inclusion currencies exist in community to help them really meet the really basic needs in the community. the counterfeiting story came mostly from the government. And it came from the idea that people are thinking that it's something that was coming, that was anti-money, because against the national currency. And that's where the problem came in. Interestingly enough, it never really came from the communities. So he didn't have that issues. And also it lied with him leveraging really on friendships that he had, people that were from the community. I come from some of those coastal communities. I'm one of them. I can be able to speak their language, to be able to get someone to translate in their own language and to show them that to look at the history of even Kenya or of African states. When William was doing the introduction, he said that this money is not something that was original in Africa. It's something that came. And for some reason, we have been told we can't live unless we have it. And so to be able to show that history, that before you are really meeting your basic needs, you are doing barter trade systems and communities were thriving. Can we be able to go back to that thriving mode? So it was quite, yes, there are a few teething challenges, but it was quite good how it was started.
Will, you have, I saw you had some Nordic DFIs, development finance institutions. You have Red Cross, global brand, super conservative, on board with this. I'm sure it didn't take you more than 10 minutes to convince all of these people. How did you get them on board? What did they like about it? And the other question is, how much money is in circulation, or how many individuals are using this digital currency?
Yeah. I think, there was a few groups that originally got involved. One was Stichting Duin from Netherlands, and they were really excited about sort of like the potential disruption that's potential, like for communities to really sort of make themselves independent and really kind of status quo in that sense. So there was a bit of just excitement, and they're a very unique donor in the world. And so that was really our first big donor that kind of came to us and said, hey, can we help you with these things? And actually they came to us after Caroline and I had gotten out of jail and had our case cleared and everything like that with the central bank. So that was a huge help. But then further on,
I knew you were a criminal.
Further on, it was about, especially when we got into digital currencies, it was about the transparency of the system, and specifically like Red Cross, they really want to know what is their impact. And Red Cross is everywhere. They're one of the biggest organizations in the world, but it's notoriously hard to track impact. And a lot of the industry around aid is moving into cash transfer programming. So they've sort of accepted the idea that maybe building a toilet is not the best way to help communities, but they actually injecting money helps much more actually. And so there's been a lot of proof around that as an aid modality. But there's a lot of problems with that, right? Like, how do you target those people? How do you know what you've done with it? How do you even know how effective it was? And so the idea of putting in a trackable, we can anonymize it on the blockchain, but a trackable voucher that can go and give them sort of parametric triggers, like we can actually see, what is the effect of COVID, for instance, based on the circulation changing in those communities, or they can see the effect of a drought based on those on the situation, on the transaction data, and be able to react to it. And so it's a really new concept for them. And like I said, we've had about $500,000 of transactions so far. We've got 20,000 people right now. I think there's about 9 million shillings worth, or 9 million tokens on the blockchain that are in circulation right now, which is about $90,000 in total. And last month we saw a growth of about 500%, especially in the areas where Red Cross is now essentially piloting this as a COVID response. And these are some of the informal settlements around Nairobi called Mukuru. And so there's been a huge uptake. Basically people just there's not enough money from Red Cross anyways to support this. So this is a huge gap as well. So in terms of financing, crisis response, sustainable development goals, or even financing kind of credit gap, it's been a huge relief to be able to come up with sort of secure systems for establishing credit in those communities and using that as an aid modality. Innovation Norway has been our other big supporter, basically through together with Red Cross. And again, with the same ethos of like, how do we use technological innovation to basically, take this entire history that we have of private and central banking and put it onto something that a group of women can do on their own cell phone. And the technology essentially is already there to do those things. So we're sort of lucky in a situation where we can go into a group of 25 women, give them the same technology that the Hong Kong Monetary Authority has, essentially, that works on their cell phone, and give them a way to establish credit amongst themselves safely. I think it's a huge thing, and I think it's bigger than we can imagine. Like how this could affect sort of decentralized finance and really create sort of decentralized economies, and do that in a safe and secure way, where we're not going to have runs on the banks in the same way you would for Goldman Sachs or these other Kenya itself has had, I think, 3 or 4 banks collapse in the last few years because they're over issuing credit without really anything behind it. And so to address that problem and to do it at the scale of a woman selling tomato, I think is extremely powerful.
Your screen has gone black. We're hearing you, so that's not a problem. It could just be a reconnection issue, which we're doing now. Carolyn, I had a question for you before we take some of the questions, which are quite extensive. Can anyone use this digital currency to take a taxi, a minibus, go shopping, buy a beer, go partying? I mean, is it universally accepted by the community?
Within the communities that we set up, yes, it's universally accepted. So I think the question for us is, when we are setting up the community inclusion currencies, making sure that they develop the loops. And most of that happens through like I said, the peer-to-peer. So once the community knows that if I use this, it can be accepted, and they can trust it, that it's a medium of exchange for us, I think that's works. Because like in some of the rural communities, they're using it for a diverse, like they don't have taxis, but they have what you call motorcycle rides. And people use use the community inclusion, they call it Miani Pesa, and they use it to pay for their rides to the market. They use it to pay for their rides to their farms, to take their children to school. There are also people that are able to go to the community portion meal with it. The community portion meal is able to pay for community service with the community inclusion currency. And so the question is, how diverse is the trade in the community? What businesses and services are there? And for most of the time, it's universally accepted. Sometimes when maybe there are goods that they want to get really far from communities that are not using the currency, that's when maybe you can say now they may need the national currency. But yes, it is universally accepted in those communities.
We're going to start taking some of the questions. If Will's video feed is not working well, as long as the audio is working, that's actually even more important than the questions. So Hugo wanted to know, either to Will or Carolyn, is the digital currency used or usable for a local renewable energy exchange?
Why don't you go ahead, Dama, and I'll
Can you timestamp that?
But for those communities, the energy that they're using is mostly local. So yes, it is used and usable for local renewable energy exchange. They can use it. So ideally, the community gets to decide what they want to use it for. I think we had one question some time back on how we can even expand that towards a solar panel, and how we can digitize that so that people can also access, especially for communities like ours that don't have regular access to electricity. And so I think that's one way that you're trying to expand it, and it could be usable for that. Apart from that, when they do, like some of the communities, they are doing what we call reusable charcoal, organic charcoal, whereby when they use excess from farm produce and there's excess of it, they can do some organic charcoal from it, and they're able to use the CICs to buy that.
Beata had a question. Basically, I think she's interested in more data on information and diagram, how the vouchers work, how they're utilized, what's included in the collateral pool. She was asking, is there a kind of PDF description of this either on your website or that we could distribute to all of the people that are here?
There's a white paper on our website. So if you go to grassecon.org and click up at white paper, you'll see some links to our GitHub. That's a very
say the website again slowly.
Grassecon, like Grassroots Economics, but just grassecon.org.
Okay.
Yeah. There is a white paper there, but I would say it's much more on the conceptual level. We're basically on the technology level. If you do go through our GitHub, you will see kind of specifications on how we do like incentives. Like when someone joins the network, how much do they get? There's an incentive to enroll others. We have a basic income program as well that we scale basic income based on some level of centrality in the network, which is interesting. Some of that stuff is there, and basically it's a big process right now of doing a lot of the documentation. And so bear with us kind of in the next month, but that white paper is kind of a good sort of introduction. Yeah.
Other question was, what's included in the collateral pool?
Yeah. So right now we're only using DAI, which is essentially a US dollar stablecoin. There's a lot of very cool technology out there. I mean, DAI itself actually is now a multi-collateral pool that includes like Ethereum, but it's being pegged to the US dollar. I think that's the work to me for the next like 5 to 10 years of establishing reserve currencies in different ways that can be sort of a mountain range of different reserve currencies. I mean, for now, we're essentially using the US dollar as our reserve, and we're kind of, we're putting that into Kenyan shillings in the Kenyan case. And I think it's a good way to bring in aid funds, so like Red Cross and, impact investors can come in and put money into these reserve funds to help these communities in that way without having to go into some sort of new sort of exotic, reserve system. But there's a lot of really cool initiatives around coming up with what should we be using? What kind of, can we use baskets of commodities? Can we use carbon credits? Could we use, Internet of Things where we're measuring soil quality as part of this reserve pool? I think is really interesting. Yeah.
Another question from Beata is, who sets the value of the assets, services traded? Do local communities set these for themselves? Either one, Carolyn or Will.
I can do it. Yeah, they set them themselves. So basically, imagine if you're selling goats in the system and you have these vouchers now. Essentially, the vouchers are backed by your goods and services. So you're spending them out into the community, and you're promising to buy them back in goats, and you're spending them one-to-one with a national currency, and you're buying them back one-to-one with a national currency. And so that's kind of how creation and issuance work at that sort of the pegging to the national currency. And in terms of pricing of commodities, it's just being held the same. And then there's this secondary market now. You have this collateral pool that if you want to basically get out of the system, if you want to basically cash out some of that collateral, you get less and less value out of that collateral pool the more empty it is. And vice versa. The more full that collateral pool is, the more value you get out of it. And so there's kind of two markets you can imagine. There's the regular market of people just trading their goods and services, pegging it to the national currency. And then there's this market that's fluctuating, the secondary market that's fluctuating because of the collateral pool around one-to-one with the national currency. And so when you create one of these systems, the price on what we call the bonding curve, or the secondary market, is basically equal to the amount of reserve you have. So imagine you have $100 in an example as reserve, and let's say you create 400 tokens of credit, and you have a required reserve requirement, and we're using 25% as our reserve requirement. So as long as that reserve is at 25%, we'll say, okay, the value on that secondary market is 1-to-1 with the national currency. And as it fluctuates around that full mark, that 25% that we've set, the exchange value goes up and down around that. There's a lot of good stuff to read around that on the white paper. You can also go look at the equations from the smart contracts we're using as well.
Okay, a couple of technical questions from, it seems, somebody who's a service provider and trying to sell some services here. How does the recently mooted digital economy trade agreements address local community decentralized digital currency game plan under conditions of potential predatory monetary infusions halted currently due to the pandemic? So probably a very technical question. If you can give us a kind of more idiot-proof answer.
I think it's a really good question, because all of these systems, when you hear about people creating tokens on the blockchain, or you hear about blockchains and gas prices and stuff like that, like a lot of them are just sort of naturally, they can be very extractive and be very manipulatable. And so the nice thing about this bonding curve technology is basically to say that you're creating, like, let's say in the example of the $100, right? If there's $100 of collateral behind the system, and there's $400 of tokens that have been created, there's very, very little incentive to pump more collateral into that system, because they'll essentially just be a sell-off. That price will just go up and it'll come back down again. So there's, if you're defining a system for credit issuance, and you're saying, this is a full collateral space, and this is a contract you cannot change, well, you're essentially constraining the ability for a Bitcoin whale or someone with a huge amount of money to come in and buy power into that system. There's really no advantage for them, because as they start adding more money into that system to mint more, they're getting diminishing returns very, very quickly. So as that, there's no reason for the collateral to become more full than what the community has set, or the regulatory system has set as full. And so I think that's, it's a challenge for these systems, because they don't necessarily scale. Like, one currency should not take over Kenya, for instance. But at the same time, that's a good thing, because the scale of that currency can be totally localized, and you can create other currencies. And that's a really important aspect, because we want community groups and municipalities and different, Red Cross to be able to create currencies. We also want them to be able to trade with each other. So that's the idea of the decentralized economy here, is to say, well, if I do have a collateral pool, like, I've got a will currency in my community, and Dama's got a Dama currency in her community, we both have a relative value. We have an automated price discovery in terms of, we know what's the collateral behind Dama, because it's on the blockchain. I can totally see what's there. She knows the collateral behind mine. So if I'm trading to her community, our two community currencies, what happens is some of my collateral ends up in her community now, right? So I exchange out for the reserve, and then I put that reserve into her community. And this is all done, again, with feature phones. So, people don't have to actually, it's all done automatically. But that creates a way that all of these communities can create their own currencies and trade with each other, and do it in a way that's safe, in the sense of, that collateral space, how much collateral or that reserve is there in each different community. So it creates safety in terms of a rule for how to do credit issuance, and it gives convertibility between all the communities in the system. So I think those two things were that was why this whole idea of bonding curves and the Bancor protocol that we're using right now was such an amazing opportunity for us to be able to say, this is how we can make many, because we printed 5 different versions of these for 5 different communities across Kenya. And the question was, okay, what's the value of this currency versus this currency, right? How many are being printed? How do you even know? How do we get rid of that need for trusting the currency printer, in other words? And so the usage of having common reserves and credit levels that sort of map trade imbalance. So, right, if I have one community that's trading with another. We want to map trade imbalance into the relative price of those currencies.
There were two other parts to that question from Dan. Could a third party custodian provide safety buffer in terms of technology and cybersecurity threats? And then the third part, how much does such incentives truly gain transparency momentum?
Okay, so on the security side, I mean, so we've been using a proof of authority blockchain for a while now, and there have been attacks on that, and the network has been strong enough to survive those. I mean, blockchain technology is all very new, and so there is a learning curve on that, but the industry is starting to harden and mature, and so where we are right now, I feel very comfortable. In terms of the security of the technology and whatnot, in terms of a security buffer around the collateral, that's essentially what Red Cross is doing. So what they do is they say, okay, or aid organizations in general, they are saying, okay, if that reserve starts to falter, well, can we put money into that reserve, mint or create tokens, and then distribute them as part of our aid program, right? And so basically they're a liquidity provider. They're adding reserve. They're taking the shares of that reserve. The currency, in a way, is kind of like a share, and they're distributing it out as they would a cash transfer program. And so in a sense, that's basically what's happening with the COVID response right now. We're basically saying, okay, here's a collateral pool. We've got $40,000 in a pool over here. Here's all the credit that we've been issuing over here. We've got about 16 million tokens in Kenyan shillings, and so that, that is sort of, there's a lot of different ways to look at the security aspects. I mean, also we're using mobile feature phones, and there's a lot of, like yesterday we had the case where we had 15 women in a savings group where they have one phone among the 15 women, and they all have SIM cards, and they're swapping those SIM cards into that phone and putting a little pin, to unlock each of their accounts in the same phone. So, it really, designing the systems to work in this environment is a huge challenge, but I think it's wonderful. So there's a lot of little weird intricacies that are super exotic in a sense here, but I think actually probably the norm for a lot of the world.
Carolyn, this is on a relatively small scale, but getting traction. What is the ambition? Is this to do it in all of Kenya and in other countries in Africa?
Yes, I think for us, the ambition is to go where the need is. So if we get communities that need this, we are willing to train and make sure that they can set this up. And like Will pointed out, now that it's blockchain and we are thinking open source, and like even what's good about it, of late we've been able to have self-registration for funds. So there's an ability for it to really scale exponentially wherever the need will be.
Going back to a question from Sergio from Colombia, who says nearly 75% of cocoa producers live below the poverty line. What is the potential to use decentralized ledger technology and the digital economy to support cocoa producers escape poverty and bring additional benefits to the environment? Either one.
Yeah.
Okay. Go on.
Yeah. Okay. One of the biggest challenges we have is that when you're dealing with communities that are, nearly 100% dependent on exporting goods or importing goods, right? Like there's usually when we go into a community and Dama can speak to this, we're looking for what are the goods and services, what are the assets in that community, and the social assets, value addition, primary production, like what is there that the people can consume themselves and that can sort of fuel this sort of circular economy. And so with cocoa production, like the amount of cocoa that they consume themselves, like that could be a really nice basis for creating a circular economy around these things. And I think generally it's the process is to go into those farmers, to go into all these areas and do that resource mapping, and it's been nice to work together with like Red Cross, because they come in as sort of a way to seed the concept as well. So Red Cross is creating currencies sort of backed by their donor funds, right? Their circular economy is kind of in and out of their donor funds. So that's been a way of sort of introducing the concept into those areas and training people how to do those things. But people around the world have been coming together, and I mean, well before what we've done, and coming up with ways to create circular economies around there. So there's a lot of stuff going on in South America already right now in terms of mutual credit and whatnot. And so I think it's very much possible. I think the challenge is, again, the import and export markets. It's a hard thing to tap into. If you can find, if you start a local currency and you find an organization that wants to do CSR by buying cocoa from you in the local currency, that could be extremely powerful. And so that, those are kind of ways to sort of bootstrap some of these concepts. So I think it's important to just think through, what is the available local resources, how can they, flow circularly with each other, and then now how do you interface with the rest of the world? And that's this kind of like monetary membrane. How do you create a membrane between that cocoa producing cooperative or community and, let's say, foreign importers?
Arvin, one of our superheroes from Southeast Asia, had a question. Does this create a risk that people spend beyond their ability, unlike the United States, which doesn't do that at all? But does this create a problem for people in Kenya to spend beyond their ability?
I'll give one analogy and I'll hand it over to Dama. I mean, the amount of currency we issue is really, really small. We start with $4 worth. And then we do a kind of basic income that ends up being like maybe 50 cents to $5 a week around that. So it's really small amounts. And, as a physicist, my idea was always like, look, if you had $1, or one bill moving at the speed of light, that's really all you need, right? So if you can create efficient markets, that's all you need. So I don't see people kind of overspending with these things just because they just don't have, a lot to begin with. But I'll let Dama kind of add to that here.
Yeah, like we pointed out, when you start with essentially it's almost like when you start, it's debt circulating. And no, we haven't had the issue of overspending because it's more of a socioeconomic tool, because it's meant to circulate, and that's the aim of it. Unlike the national currency that it's more about, if I amass so much of it, I am like super rich, I can be Bill Gates and all that. This is about giving back to the community also. I should be able to meet my needs, and I should also be able to spend it so that it circulates within the community. So no, we've not had issues of spending beyond that means, because it's not designed the way that national currency is, such that it would encourage more spending. And sometimes I think with the traditional monetary system, the whole issue of spending beyond your means is because you tend to go out and then you make other people rich. So like for an instance, if you start with donor fund and you give that whole community equal amounts, they'll all take a motorcycle ride and go to the nearest town and buy things that are not for basic, so that they can just spend. And so that wealth is coming off of the community, but the CIC is wealth that's within the community, and the trust and the real spend beyond their ability.
I might add also that we do a holding fee, right? So on dormant accounts, or if you haven't traded in a month, we do take, we have a pool. So like, it's like kind of like a demurrage, like a negative interest in a way. So it's not in your favor to hold on to these for a long time unless you're using them. So if people are not using their tokens, we basically take that as a pool. We take a little bit, basically like $1 a month out of those accounts that are not using it, and we put it into a basic income for everybody else. And so there is a little bit of a circular pressure around that. So it's not, people don't want to hoard these and or anything like that, but they do want to be able to spend them. And most of the spending, we have a nice dashboard that was just recently created. And maybe I can stick the link up here. But that shows kind of the categories of spending. So you'll see people spending for, and they're a little bit kind of large scale categories right now, but like food and water is the main thing, farming and labor, savings groups. So these women's groups are really common. Those are kind of the top few categories. I'll share that here.
Type it in the chat.
Yeah.
There was another question here from Beata. Do you work with Pawami or Mwezi, MWEZI, or Trine, TRINE, as regards solar products?
No, not yet. And we're, it's a big thing that we talk about even with Red Cross today. We're just saying, if there's organizations that can start taking, accepting these community currencies, even as a part of their CSR program and spending them back in the communities. It's also a nice way to advertise those businesses within the networks as well, right? So if I can spend 10% of my solar panel cost in local currency, great, I'm going to buy that solar panel. So it's a nice marketing kind of aspect, and it's also a nice CSR. So if that company is accepting these, it also means that they can spend them back, give them to employee bonuses and things like that too, or even create their own community currencies based on their own backing. And we have a company that Dama's working with that is a fabric company, and they've switched to making masks now, and they're doing that as well. So their masks are basically going to be sold for the community currencies. The company is going to accept that into their company and redistribute it as part of their kind of CSR and to help COVID as well.
Hugo wanted to know if you're familiar. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it. Agunity, AGUNITY, is doing for farmers in Africa.
No, it is. Dama. Do you know them?
No.
I would just say there's so many amazing groups like a 1 Acre Fund and a lot of groups that are doing a lot of amazing work. Our entire staff is about 12 people, and most of them are just on the phones doing phone support, like when people need to reset their pins and things like that. And so we really depend on Red Cross and other aid groups to fill all those gaps. And like, you go into a lot of rural communities and you say, okay, now that you're able to save more money and there's more economy going on, what are you going to do? And like 90% of the people raise their hand and say, I want to do a wholesale shop, or I want to raise chickens. And then that's it, and so it's really nice to have partners that come in and say, here's how you build a fish farm, or here's how you can do, different types of farming or solar. I wish we could do all of that stuff ourselves, but we can't really. So we really need that sort of, those types of people to look at these technology and say, oh, we can incorporate a community currency into X, Y, and Z, and this would help us reach more people, create sustainable economies, and we want to do reforestation or sustainable woodlots or green charcoal. This is a way to tie that into an economy, and I think that's super important because for the last my entire time in Kenya, I think about 12 years, I have seen so many aid organizations come in and say, this is what we need, or this is a great addition for forestry or women's issues or gender-based violence or whatever. And it's just, well, is there a way to sort of economize that and create flows around all of those great ideas?
Brian wanted to know, is your token listed on an exchange? One, if not, where is it traded? And finally, how do the buyers and sellers find bidders, find bid, ask, and liquidity?
Yeah. So no, not yet. Essentially, we're on the XDAI blockchain right now, which is a side chain of Ethereum. And so you can actually find our tokens there, but you can't buy them, at least not yet. The idea, again, is not to buy the tokens, but actually to use this Bancor protocol to fill the reserves of those tokens. So essentially, you would say, okay, I'm going to add let's say $100 of DAI into the reserve of this system, I'm going to mint or create new tokens, and I'm either going to hold those because I provided liquidity for the community, or I'm going to redonate those out as the community. So we haven't fully done that bridging yet. There's a bridge to mainnet, for the DAI as well. So that's all, hopefully in the next few months.
Arvind wanted to know, apart from being arrested, you and Carolyn, did you encounter legal or control issues from the government? But I guess getting arrested was a legal or control issue from the government.
Well, yeah, that was a bad one. Just to maybe a short story that like the director of public prosecution came out and said there's no law against a circulating promissory note like this. Like it's not illegal in any sense. They recommended to the central banks to start regulating and monitoring these things. And I think, what we've done in terms of the blockchain for me is 1,000x the regulation that banks have, right? Because you can actually see at any second what's behind these things and come up with standards around that. So our standard right now is a collateral pool of 25% of the tokens in circulation. And what we did last year was there was a blockchain task force with the government that we were invited to explain this stuff to. So we did that. And so I feel like the government's warming up to the idea. A lot of governments are also looking at now creating a digital version of their own, central bank currency. So that could be used as the reserve of these things, and that would fit basically kind of perfectly into sort of a decentralized credit issuance where they still have some control over the system, in terms of the reserve. So I think there's a lot of positive ways to go forward with government around these things, and we don't, again, like we never tell people don't use your national currency. This is what you use when you don't have any. And that's very clear to most people that, we're not trying to replace the national currency. We're trying to basically complement it and be counter-cyclic to it so that people can still eat when they just don't have any national currency.
Carolyn, is there any country in Africa that has experience with digital currency that is looking at universal basic income through a digital currency?
Okay. So from that we did the feasibility study, no, but they have what we call mobile money. So like when we want to see how the uptake will be in terms of digital currency, we see if maybe the country has ever done digital money. I think we've heard of the M-Pesa in Kenya. So like a good country like Zimbabwe, they're having a lot of issue with their national currency, but they're using a lot of the mobile money. So for them, it's like a digital currency because there's no hard cash. And so that's one example of a country that will do really well. And they held a UNDP-funded forum whereby they were looking at options of how to go about helping people meet their basic needs in the face of lack of liquidity because there's no national currency in circulation. Malawi next to it also is thinking about that, only is that the mobile money prevalence is not as high. Also Cameroon wants to do it, but some parts, especially the rural parts, don't do a lot of mobile money. So for such countries, you see how you can go about it, but I think they say necessity is the mother of invention. Sometimes even when they haven't done mobile money, as long as they're able to send SMSs. And like Will pointed out, since it works even on a burner phone, it's quite easy using the USSD codes. So even you don't need internet connection, it's really simple. It can work on a really simple phone. So I think that can be easy to do for most of the countries. And Ethiopia too, though they don't have the mobile money. But you see that if you look at things like how in Kenya we have what we call bonga points, like reward systems that telcos use for people, and they can go get rewards from the points that they earn from using credit. And you can find that in places like Ethiopia that's taking place. And the question is, what about countries that have prevalence of refugees? And what's it's good to notice that most of those refugees are really tech savvy. And so even like when you try a pilot and you tell them this is how it's going to work, they're really quick in uptake, because most of them, when they go to a new country, the first thing they want to do is to do business. They want to look for ways that they can be able to connect with the population there. Most of the time they don't have money, but they have a phone, or they're willing to share their phone with someone else to be able to do this. So yes, I think it's quite possible to do it. What also is good about Africa, I think most people are pointing out, is the high number of youth. We have, most of our population is youthful. And so they are quite tech savvy. And once you're able to get some of the youth to be able to do it, it's quite easy to explain. Because even like when William was talking about some of the saving groups and they only have one phone, when we were doing the training for those saving groups, most of them were illiterate. They couldn't be able to do it. But you'd get lots of youth in the community that were quite quick in doing it. And they're willing to go around in the different saving groups to explain, this is how it works. This is how you can be able to save even the digital currency and pull it as a resource for the community. And this is how a donor can be able to add value to what you're already doing in the community. So yes, I believe it can work.
We have a couple of questions of how to connect to you both. So TBLI uses the Tony Soprano method for connecting people. So you basically have to send a pile of digital currency to either Sam or Ricky. They have to be able to spend that in a club or at a restaurant to make sure that it's legal. Once that happens, we connect you up with Will and Caroline, or you can look in the chat box and see the LinkedIn connection. Scott wanted to know, what is the current multiplier effect you're seeing in terms of the dollars or donor dollars coming into the system versus the total impact being created in the community?
I think we have a good blog about this on our website. I think I just pulled the numbers a day or two ago, and in Nairobi we were looking at just this last month alone, the amount of money we spent, in terms of like the backing on the currency, compared to the amount of trade volume was about 30x. So we had like something like $90,000 of trade and something like it was $1,000 to $2,000 worth of the backing that was used behind it. So 30x is pretty good. And overall, since we started this, on the blockchain, so if you look at all of our blockchain data, which is nice about the blockchain, you can actually see every single transaction. We've got about the $500,000 of transactions, and I think the multiplier there was something like 18x. So yeah, it's pretty amazing to see that level of, a little bit amount of money is able to create a huge amount of circulation. And really all that money is doing is holding this collateral, right? It's basically keeping the money pegged to the national currency, and it's keeping the trust of the businesses that they know that if they need to get out of the system that they're able to.
Tia wanted to know, could individuals benefit from deciding over monetary policy themselves? Question. But then sometimes crowds aren't that wise after all. So what do you think is best practice in terms of governing such local community currencies?
Yeah. So, the contracts that we're setting up, I think it's an interesting contract, right, to look at, because, once you've created your tokens, you've created your supply, and you've put in that reserve, the whole point of this contract that you created is that you can never touch it again. Like, you can never touch that reserve again. The only people who can touch it are the ones who have the credit. They're able to essentially burn that credit and pull out some of that reserve, and then vice versa. People can add reserve. So you're creating a contract around credit issuance, and you can do that in a really, aware and open way. And the contracts we're using, there's a lot of knobs that are potential there, and there's a lot of ways to augment these. So coming up with standards around this stuff is a huge thing. And we've been using this level of 25% collateral compared to your supply of credit, and also like the size, like how much credit needs to be put in, like what is the initial space. It's all really important stuff to sort of standardize, and that's another nice thing about Red Cross, especially like IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross. They really want to sort of establish, like, okay, if Scott Morris creates a Ithaca CIC there, and at least we can transparently see the contract he created there, right? So if Red Cross or the government wants to say, is that legal? Is that should we donate to it or should we support it? Well, they can look at those variables and say, is this a safe contract or not? So I think it's a new space to be in, and I think it's really exciting, like that the idea of communities coming up with what these contracts are, and then the space of needing to sort of audit those contracts becomes really interesting and possible because of blockchain.
We're coming to the final question. Lisa Howitt wanted to know, are all of your reserves currently acquired through donor funds, or are chamas or / businesses expected to contribute to reserves in order to mint currency?
Yeah. Right now, it's let's say 99% donor funds, but we are also just starting to allow community groups to basically also add into that reserve pool and get essentially leverage based on adding to that pool. That's something we're really just starting to experiment with and kind of A/B test. What are the rules around that? But so far it's been Red Cross and Duin, and we had a Gitcoin grant as well that have supported that reserve. But I think ultimately that's not, for a sustainable version of this, or if you're a community group in Colombia, you may not want to, or you definitely don't depend on donor aid to create that reserve for you, right? If you want to be able to make these things sustainable, then essentially some amount of that needs to come from the community itself over time. I mean, what we're doing right now, in a way, is very much a COVID response, in terms of the Sarafu currency you'll see on the dashboard that I added there. But the real dream behind this is much more, community-centered approaches, and for communities to basically say, we have a community reserve of goats and whatnot that we are committed to accepting on the vouchers, and we have a collateral pool, and we're deciding, how much to create in all of these things.
Carolyn, how do you like working with this nerdy guy?
It's good because I'm more the community person, and it means that during calls like this, he can do the nerdy work, and I can do more of the community. I think we are a good fit because I am really interested in sort of translating what he sees as the bigger picture into a way that the community can be able to understand. And most of the time, especially, communities don't really want to know what's the back-end technology that's going on behind all this. All they want to know is how will it be able to help me access what, or be able to meet what particular need they have at the moment. And for me, it's really good to be able to do that, to be able to show them that here is a tool that can work for you. And it's good to have William to be able to worry about, is the blockchain working or not? And how can we make it open source? How can we worry about why? And what kind of tech partners can we bring in? How would the USSBs code work and all that? And also, how would when he talks about the bonding curve, it's not something I can go say in the community, but it's my responsibility to be able to go and really say to them in a way that they would understand, in a way that they would relate to it. So it's been amazing. I think we learned quite a lot from each other, and yeah, we are a good fit.
I'm going to allow this last question. Derek squeezed in one last question. To scale trust beyond technology, will you consider new types of governance?
For me, I'm more excited about voting systems than I am currencies. And I think that, adding participatory budgeting and voting, like we talked about having a basic income that we're playing with right now. But what if the community can really vote on where those pools go? So there's some really, kind of minimal viable commons kind of architecture that is possible here with creating voting systems around these things. And also, on the blockchain space, in terms of like the contracts themselves and the ownership around the knobs on the contracts and things like that is super important. And so I think, this space is, to me, opening up, because if if in your wallet you have the ability now not just to transact and create and establish value in your community, but you also have the ability to vote on participatory budgeting and all sorts of stuff. So the integration of those two things, I think, is really what will fundamentally change, our ability to create democracy and governance structures in these communities, and really, give them the power to decide all of this stuff themselves. For now, we're still kind of building clunky, 1950s, pickup trucks and things like that. And eventually, the technology is getting so advanced and so easy to use that people ought to be able to design their own systems quite easily and set all the rules for these things. We're just doing the best we can, kind of A/B testing, trying to see what works, creating essentially kind of vanilla versions of this stuff. But the customization and voting systems, I think, is really where the future is.
Okay, final seconds. Carolyn, what can this audience that's listening do to help you? And Will, what can this audience do to help you?
I think it's spreading the word about the beauty of community inclusion currency, especially when I think about post-COVID and how so many of our communities really need this right now. So for us to be able to go further and impact more communities would be really important. And getting support towards that would be really good. And also in terms, so like right now, yes, most of our funding is donor dependent. And so to be able to work that out and reach more people, I think would be good for me.
Will?
Like Innovation Norway has done an amazing job of pooling together funds and targeting innovations around the world, and so they've been a huge supporter recently along together with Red Cross, and I really like that model, and I think that so we're building, this is all open source technology, it's building on top of a lot of other open source technology. So, to have a basket of funds that is able to, like an innovation fund that is able to say, okay, we want to pilot this in Colombia, we want to do this there and there, and to have those resources. Caroline and I don't even have a salary, at all. Like this is very, very grassroots. I think, like the person who gets paid most in our entire operation and gets $700 a month to do basically our admin work. So we're super, super tiny operation. So, having not necessarily even funding for us, but just funding to really spread these concepts. And I feel like sometimes we're a bottleneck. People keep asking us, oh, we want you to do it here and here and here and here. And it's like, well, how can we possibly do that unless we get some partners or groups that are willing to spread this stuff. And so, even on the banking side, it would be really nice to have cooperatives or credit unions that are getting into these concepts that would like to spread these things because they already have regulatory advantage wherever they are. So getting organizations into this idea of saying, there is a way we can establish credit systems, and here's how that would be an advantage to us in our communities. I think just that awareness is really powerful, but also having enough funds to pay some paychecks and things like that would be wonderful as well.
We all live for dreams like that. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you also the people listening, Will and Carolyn. Thank you so much for taking the time. We're very grateful. TBLI tries to bring together and does brilliant, authentic thought leaders every week to inspire and give you great ideas. Support us in this work by becoming a member, which we will be launching soon, or supporting our foundation. I have to thank a lot of people who worked on the production of this webinar. First of all, most important, Sam, our webinar producer and ambient DJ, Ricky, the cooking machine and absolute better half, Donnie Trump, our sun tanning and makeup advisor, Xi Jinping, head of transparency and integrity, Jair Bolsonaro, director of forest conservation, Kellyanne Conway, in charge of alternative facts department, Boris Johnson, our hairstylist, and Joe Biden, our mental health coach. Thank you again. See you next week.
Thank you.
Ready?